Welcome back to Rapid Response Series, Did You Know? CIUS Answers, a daily response to your questions about Russia's war against Ukraine. With us today is Dr. Serhiy Bilenky, a historian specializing in 19th-century Ukrainian and Eastern European history. Currently, Dr. Bilenky is a research associate with CIUS. Welcome, Serhiy. My question for you today is, why do Russians and Ukrainians both have Cossacks? Are they the same?
It's a great question, but it will require some details. Cossacks in Ukraine and Russia had similar origins in the frontier communities living on the edge between sedentary areas and steppes dominated by the nomadic peoples, primarily by Muslim Tatars. The word Cossack itself is of Turkic origins, literally meaning free man, and it referred to anyone who could not fit properly in existing society, instead would go into the steppes where he acknowledged no authority. The first Cossack communities in Ukraine emerged in the end of the 15th century and consisted of men who went to the steppes to practice various trades, but most importantly, were engaged in hunting, gathering, fishing, beekeeping, and so on. While there, they were often confronted by the Tatar raiders, as there was always permanent danger in the fields. And that's why the people had to fight off. In the 16th century, with the growing threats from Muslim Tatars and Turks, Cossack communities acquired more formal organization. For instance, the Tatar raids forced the Great Duchy of Lithuania, that controlled much of Ukraine at the time, to start building fortresses in the middle Dnipro region, and few were built among them Kaniv, Cherkasy, Vinnytsia, and other towns. The defense of these fortresses was entrusted to Cossacks that became known as town Cossacks or Horodovi Kozaki. Meanwhile, further south, along the Dnipro River, Cossack structure emerged in the Zaporizhia, literally beyond the Dnipro Rapids or cataracts, as a defense of the steppe settlers against Tatar raids. Similar Cossack communities emerged also on the territory of present-day Russia, above all on the river Don, the so-called Don Cossacks. While most Cossacks in Ukraine, but not all of them, were ethnic Ukrainians, most Cossacks in Russia were ethnic Russians. There were always other ethnicities present, both in Ukraine and in Russia. That's important. Since the late 16th century, Cossacks became a major military force in Ukraine and a distinct social group within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Cossacks often rebelled against the authorities while seeking recognition as a privileged socialist state on the par with the nobles. The Cossacks played a leading role in the Polish-Cossack War led by Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, which led to the establishment of the Cossack state in 1648. Known as the Hetmanate. In 1654, the Hetmanate entered the political alliance with Russian Tsars or Tsars of Moscow. The autonomous Hetmanate was essentially a Cossack-run state in which Cossacks were the pillar of society. In the 18th century, there was a long period of decline of the Hetmanate, especially after the failed Hetman Mazep revolt against Tsar Peter I of the Great in 1708-1709. The Hetmanate was ultimately dismantled by the Russian authorities in the 1780s. It ceased to exist as a kind of separate administrative entity. The Zaporozhian siege, the center of Zaporozhian Cossacks for the south, was destroyed by Russians even earlier in 1775. Eventually, many former Zaporozhians were resettled to Kuban in the foothills of the Caucasus, where they formed the Kuban Cossack host, which was created to fight against the mountaineers, such as Chechens, Circassians, Dagestanis, and others. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, during the long 19th century, basically until 1917, until the dissolution of the Russian Empire, there were no organized Cossack military formations, let alone self-governing Cossack communities. Cossacks existed only as a distinct social state in left Ukraine, roughly today's Chernihiv Oblast, Poltava Oblast, part of Kiev Oblast, a socialist state akin to state peasants, but with certain military rights and obligations. In ethnic Russia, however, self-governing Cossack communities existed in various places, again, on the Don, in Kuban, in the Ural Mountains, and in Siberia, at least until 1917, and probably slightly beyond. What is also interesting, worthwhile to emphasize, it is these Russian Cossack communities that often became the punitive forces of the Russian Tsars, Russian government, against the revolutionaries, against the Jews during the pogroms, against various national minorities in the late 19th and early 20th century. These were not Ukrainian Cossacks, as is erroneously believed by some people in the West. And this is important. And now in conclusion, about a major paradox that points to different roles that Cossacks played in Ukrainian and Russian histories and historical memories. In Ukraine, Cossacks were in the center stage of history, almost synonymous with the early modern period, and also a symbol of Ukraine throughout centuries, as a main symbol of Ukraine, even until these days. And paradoxically, because this was a paradox in my view, because the Cossacks as a distinct self-governing community did not even exist in the 19th and 20th centuries. In Russia, by contrast, Cossack hosts did exist until the 20th century, but they were seen as only a part of history, greatly overshadowed by the history of autocratic state, centered on Moscow and then St. Petersburg. So basically, the history of the state, or autocratic state, was in the focus of both historians, but also political imaginations of Russians. Until today, Cossacks symbolize the democratic potential of Ukraine, in sharp contrast with autocratic traditions of Russia. What we can see playing out in front of our eyes these days during this vicious Russian invasion of Ukraine. I hope I addressed this question at least partially, so thank you.
Thank you, Serhiy. That explains a lot. And to our audience, please keep your questions coming. We'll be back tomorrow with another question and answer on Ukraine.